Millionaire saw his fiancée lock his daughter in a dark room. What he later discovered shattered him. Alexander Moore stood in the middle of the grand hall, his hand unconsciously tightening around the car keys still in his grip. The silence that engulfed the mansion brought back a familiar sensation from years past. Years when this place had been nothing more than a cold block of concrete for him to return to after long flights, endless meetings, and numbers that never slept. He had once believed he was accustomed to loneliness. Alexander was the kind of man the media often described with flattering labels: hedge fund CEO, financial prodigy, a self-made magnate. At 38, he possessed more than he would ever need: wealth, power, reputation. But deep inside, Alexander was a man who had lost faith in people. His first marriage had ended bitterly when his ex-wife walked away, taking with her a massive share of his fortune and leaving him with an infant daughter. From that moment on, Alexander learned to build high, thick walls, allowing no one to come too close. Except Lily. Lily Moore was the single center of his closed-off world. 6 years old, small in frame, quieter than most children her age. Lily did not throw tantrums or make demands. She had a habit all her own, sitting for hours on the floor, drawing with inexpensive colored pencils. Her sketches were clumsy and misshapen, yet they always included a sun, flowers, and 3 figures holding hands. Alexander never fully understood the world inside his daughter's drawings, but he knew one thing: whenever Lily drew, she felt safe. And then Clara appeared. Clara Hayes did not belong to Alexander's world. She had once been a preschool teacher, more familiar with children's laughter and tears than with ringing phones and stock charts. Clara was gentle, patient, and possessed a rare ability to open Lily's heart. She did not try to replace Lily's biological mother, nor did she seek to win Alexander's favor. She simply stayed, reading to Lily every night, listening to innocent questions, and keeping every drawing Lily made as if each were a treasure. That was what made Alexander believe that perhaps, this time, he had not been wrong. He turned back to the car and opened the passenger door. On the seat lay 2 carefully chosen gifts: a deep blue velvet box containing an exquisite necklace for Clara, not meant to impress, but to express his gratitude for her patience in staying. Beside it was a handmade doll he had brought from Japan, with soft black hair and large, round eyes, the very one Lily had once pointed to in a drawing and said, "I like this." Holding the 2 gifts in his hands, Alexander stepped back into the grand hall. A faint smile crossed his lips, anticipating the moment he would give them away. Alexander set the gifts down on the console table beside the grand hall. The soft sound of the velvet box touching the wood made him flinch, as if in this house any noise had suddenly become too loud. He moved slowly through the living room, his eyes passing over every familiar detail: the gray leather sofa, the slightly crooked abstract painting on the wall, the glossy black piano in the corner. Everything was still intact. Too intact. "Lily!" Alexander called again, his voice lower now, tighter. "Where are you?" There was no answer, only the steady, cold, indifferent hum of the air conditioner. Alexander felt his heartbeat begin to quicken. He glanced at his watch. At this hour, Lily should have been home long ago. And Clara. Clara usually waited for him with a cup of hot tea and a dozen small questions that he pretended to complain about, though in truth he found them comforting. He stepped into the kitchen. Empty. The counter was spotless, as if dinner had never been prepared. The glass door leading to the backyard was ajar, the curtain fluttering lightly in the breeze. Alexander moved closer and placed his hand on the doorframe. And then he heard it. A very faint, broken sound, as though it had been torn apart by the wind before it could fully form. Alexander froze. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. Not music, not laughter. It was crying. But not the kind of crying a child makes from falling or throwing a tantrum. It was a hoarse, shattered sound, the cry of someone who had been crying for far too long, to the point of no longer having the strength to cry out loud. A cry so suppressed it had turned into despair. Alexander stopped thinking. The instinct of a father surged violently within him. He burst through the glass door and ran straight into the backyard. His expensive leather shoes crushed the dew-damp grass, but he felt nothing. His eyes swept past the infinity pool, past the perfectly trimmed rose hedges. The crying was not coming from the main house. It echoed from farther away, from the far end of the property, where an old structure stood unused. The old service quarters, a damp, dark place forgotten by both time and wealth. Alexander clearly remembered it as the place his mother, Margaret Moore, had once insisted on keeping for family memories, even though he had repeatedly suggested tearing it down. Alexander ran. Each step carried him closer to the fear that was tightening around his chest. The crying grew clearer, more heart-rending. "Lily!" he shouted, his voice breaking in panic. There was no answer, only weak sobbing in reply. The old wooden door of the building came into view. Warped, moldy. Alexander reached out and pushed. It did not budge. The door was locked. A rusted iron latch had been fastened securely from the outside. Someone had deliberately locked someone inside. A blind rage surged through him. Alexander hurled his body against the door. The second impact sent the latch flying open with a harsh metallic clang. The door burst wide. The stench of damp rot and sewage rushed straight into his face. Dim light filtered through a small dust-covered window, illuminating the decayed bathroom with broken tiles and walls stained with dark blotches. And there, on the cold tiled floor, was Lily. His daughter was curled up like a wounded little animal. Her dress was filthy, her shoulders shaking with each breath. Around her, papers were scattered across the floor. Lily's daily drawings, torn, crumpled, and trampled without mercy. Broken fragments of colored pencils lay strewn about like evidence of deliberate cruelty. Alexander dropped to his knees. The world before him seemed to shatter into pieces. And then, when he lifted his head, his heart nearly stopped. Because standing right there in that room, beside his daughter, was someone he had never expected. Clara Hayes. In that moment, Alexander Moore felt as if all the blood in his body had frozen. Clara Hayes stood there, right beside Lily. The faint light from the grimy window fell across her pale face, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She was not crying. She was not screaming. She simply stood motionless, as if she herself had been thrown into this nightmare. "Clara?" Alexander's voice dropped, hoarse and strained. It was not the voice of a man who had just found his daughter locked inside hell. It was the voice of someone clinging to the last fragments of his sanity. Clara startled and turned around. "Alexander, I heard a noise. I ran out and saw the door slightly open. Lily inside. I was trying to—" "Trying to do what?" Alexander roared, cutting her off. His voice echoed through the damp room, making Lily flinch. The little girl tightened her arms around her knees, lowering her face to the floor. Alexander took another step forward. His eyes swept over the scene, the torn drawings, the broken fragments of colored pencils, the latch lying on the floor. Everything assembled itself in his mind into a single, merciless conclusion. "You found her like this?" he asked, his voice turning icy. "Then why was the door locked from the outside?" Clara froze. She turned to look at the door, at the rusted latch that had just been broken open. 1 second, just 1 second of hesitation, but to Alexander it felt like a confession. I didn't notice," Clara said, her voice faltering. "I just thought I had to get her out immediately." "You didn't notice?" Alexander let out a short, dry laugh, completely devoid of humor. "You didn't notice that someone was locked in here? You didn't notice that someone had locked the door from the outside? Old memories, buried deep for years, suddenly rose up like corpses from the depths. The face of his ex-wife, beautiful and perfect in front of the media cameras, yet cruel beyond measure behind closed doors, loving promises, fake tears, and finally, naked betrayal. Alexander looked at Clara, but he was no longer truly seeing her. In his mind, the two women overlapped into one familiar silhouette, gentle on the outside, vicious within. "I've seen enough," Alexander said, each word falling heavily, like hammer blows. "I'm far too familiar with this kind of performance." "No, Alexander, please." Clara stepped forward, her trembling hands reaching out as if to touch Lily. "I swear to you I didn't do this. I love her. I would never—" "Don't touch my daughter." Alexander's voice was sharp as a blade. He moved quickly, knelt down, and lifted Lily into his arms. Her small body was icy and shaking violently. Lily let out a startled cry, then recognized her father's familiar scent, and immediately wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face against his shirt as she sobbed. "I was scared." "Daddy, I was scared," Lily whispered, her voice broken. The fury inside Alexander flared violently, burning away all capacity for reason. He stood up, holding his daughter tightly, and slowly turned toward Clara. In his eyes now there was none of the warmth of the man who once held her hand every night. There remained only contempt, pain, and a blind, seething rage. "I was wrong," Alexander said slowly. "I was a fool to believe that someone could genuinely love a child who is not their own." Those words pierced Clara's heart like blades. She stood frozen, her lips moving but unable to form any sound. Alexander turned his back, carrying Lily out of that dark room. Behind him, Clara remained standing, amid the stench of dampness, amid the shattered drawings, and the trust that had just been crushed. Alexander carried Lily out of the old service building, each step heavy, as if he were walking on his own chest. The little girl buried her face into his shoulder, her small arms clinging tightly, as though letting go for even a moment would allow the darkness to swallow her again. Lily's breathing was rapid and trembling, every breath carving deeper into the fury that was boiling inside Alexander. As he reached the garden, two figures came rushing toward them from the direction of the main mansion. Oh my God, Mr. Alexander! It was Rose and Helen, two housemaids who had served the Moore family for over 10 years, since before Alexander had inherited the estate. Their faces were pale, their eyes filled with panic when they saw Lily's pitiful condition. Helen raised a hand to cover her mouth. "The child? What happened to her?" Alexander stopped. His cold gaze swept over the two women standing before him. In that moment, he needed an explanation, a reason, a truth strong enough to quiet the chaos screaming inside his head. "You've both been here all day," Alexander said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Did you know about this? Did you know my daughter was locked inside that room?" Rose and Helen exchanged a glance, a very quick, very brief look, but it did not escape Alexander's eyes. It was not surprise, nor outrage. It was hesitation, fear. Clara had now stepped out of the old building. Her clothes were soiled, her face pale, but when she saw the two maids, a fragile glimmer of hope flickered in her eyes. "Tell him the truth," Clara pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, you both know how I treat Lily. I have never—" "That's enough," Alexander cut in. "I want to hear it from them." Helen lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled. Then suddenly she burst into sobs. "I'm sorry, sir. We didn't dare to tell you," Helen's voice broke. "Miss Clara, she told us not to tell you." Alexander clenched his jaw. "Not tell me what?" Rose swallowed hard, then as if she had made up her mind, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "Whenever you went on business trips, Miss Clara would lock Lily in the old service quarters. She said the child was a nuisance, said her drawings were nothing but trash. Clara went rigid. "No, that's a lie," she cried out, tears spilling over. "I have never—" Helen cut her off, her voice shaking but dramatic. "She even threatened us. She said that if we told you, she would make sure we were fired and wouldn't receive a single penny." The air seemed to freeze. Alexander looked at Clara. In his mind, everything began to fit together with brutal clarity. The silence in the house, the locked door, the torn drawings, Lily's fear, and now the testimony of two women who had served his family for over a decade, women he had always believed to be loyal. Clara shook her head repeatedly, as if shaking harder could make the accusations disappear. "They're lying. Why would they lie like this?" Alexander did not answer. He saw Clara's tears, but he had seen such tears before, the tears of his ex-wife when her betrayal had been exposed. In this moment, his fear of being deceived once again completely overpowered his reason. "That's enough," Alexander said, his voice dropping, cold and merciless. "I've heard enough." Clara felt as though the ground beneath her had collapsed. She looked at Lily. The little girl had stopped crying, her wide eyes staring at Clara in confusion, without hatred, only fear. But Alexander had already turned away. And it was that false testimony, spoken out of fear and calculation, that became the final hammer blow, shattering the fragile remnants of trust within the Moore estate. Alexander carried Lily back toward the mansion without saying another word. Each step he took was firm and cold, as though slowing down, even for a second, would allow doubt to creep in and shatter the decision he had just forced himself to believe was right. Behind him, Clara stood frozen in the garden, the sunset casting a frighteningly pale hue across her face. "Alexander, please," Clara called after him, her voice breaking. "You can't just believe them like this. Lily, she knows I didn't do that." Alexander paused for the briefest breath, then kept walking. He did not turn around. If he turned back, if he looked into Clara's eyes one more time, he feared that the anger, the only thing holding him upright, would fall apart. Inside the grand hall, Alexander set Lily down on the sofa and wrapped a blanket around her. Lily was no longer crying, but her body was still trembling. Her wide, hollow eyes kept darting toward the staircase leading to the second floor, as if something even more terrifying than the old bathroom was hidden there. Clara followed them in. She stood a few steps away from Alexander, her hands clenched together. "Please," she said softly. "Listen to me one more time. I have never hurt Lily. I swear." Alexander turned to her. His eyes no longer burned. They were ice cold. "You have 10 minutes," he said. "Pack your things and leave my house." Clara froze. You're throwing me out?" "If you are still here in 10 minutes, Alexander continued, his voice flat and merciless, "I will call the police. And I promise you, Clara, I have enough money and enough lawyers to turn your life into hell for child abuse." Those words struck Clara like a slap to the face. She stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. This was no longer the man who used to sit for hours listening to her talk about her classroom, nor the man who once held her hand and said Lily was lucky to have her. Standing before her now was only a father blinded by the fear of betrayal. Rose and Helen stood off to the side, not daring to lift their heads. Clara looked at them, her eyes searching for a flicker of remorse, a sign of truth. But the women avoided her gaze, their eyes unconsciously flicking upstairs, to the hallway where Margaret Moore's bedroom lay silent behind its heavy wooden door. That detail made Clara pause. Lily tugged lightly at Alexander's sleeve. "Daddy?" Her voice was very small. "I don't hate Miss Clara." Alexander hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. He stroked his daughter's head, murmured a few awkward words of reassurance, then turned to Clara one last time. "Go," he said. "Don't make me repeat myself. Clara was no longer crying. The pain inside her settled, giving way to another feeling, cold, sharp. As she turned and walked up the stairs to pack her things, a question echoed in her mind, refusing to disappear. If it wasn't me, then who was it? In the bedroom, Clara hastily stuffed a few belongings into her suitcase. But the image that haunted her was not Alexander's accusation. It was Lily's eyes. Eyes filled with fear that were not directed at her, but always fixed upward, toward the second floor, toward the room of the one person everyone in the house feared. She carried her suitcase, stepped into the hallway, and went down the staircase in silence. Alexander stood in the grand hall, his hand still resting on Lily's shoulder, neither looking at her nor saying another word. Clara stopped a few steps away from him. "Alexander," she spoke. Her voice was no longer trembling, no longer pleading. It was frighteningly calm. "Today, you chose to believe your fear instead of the truth." Alexander did not turn around. Clara took a deep breath. "You will regret this," she continued, each word slow but resolute. "Not because you sent me away, but because you have just turned your back on the only person who truly stands on your daughter's side." This time Alexander's hand tightened slightly around Lily, but he still did not respond. Clara turned and walked out. The grand doors of the Moore estate closed behind her with a dull, heavy click, like the full stop at the end of a chapter of life. Before passing through the towering iron gates, Clara paused. She turned back to look one last time at the cold white mansion standing rigid in the fading light. It was a place she had once called home. Now it was nothing more than a massive fortress imprisoning dark secrets. A tear welled at the corner of her eye. Clara lifted her hand and wiped it away before it could fall. Her gaze was no longer weak. Only one thing remained in it: determination. If no one would protect Lily, then she would. If the truth was buried inside that house, she would dig it up. Clara pulled her suitcase forward and walked straight ahead, never looking back again. And in that very moment, upstairs in the Moore mansion, another woman was smiling with satisfaction, believing she had just removed the final obstacle in her path. Night fell heavily over the Moore estate, as if the darkness itself carried the echoes of the chaos that had just unfolded. Inside the dark oak-paneled study, Alexander sat motionless behind his desk, an untouched glass of whiskey before him. The yellow light cast down on his face, revealing a deep exhaustion, not that of a businessman after a long day, but of a man who had just destroyed with his own hands what he once believed to be right. The door opened very softly. Margaret Moore stepped in, her posture straight, her movements slow yet commanding. Nearly 70, she still carried the air of someone who had once controlled everything in this house, from how the living room was arranged to the fate of those who lived within it. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, her dark suit impeccably pressed. "I told you, Alexander," she said in a low, even voice, like a conclusion long prepared. "That woman was never simple." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. Her hand rested on his shoulder, a gesture that might have seemed comforting, yet weighed on him like suffocation. "I tried not to judge," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I truly believed she loved Lily." Margaret sighed faintly, as if pitying her son's naivete. "Women like that are very good at acting, just like Lily's mother. You forget so quickly." She turned to draw the curtains, shutting out the dark garden beyond. "Money and status are always what they are after. Lily is merely an obstacle." Her words sank into Alexander, blending with the shame and the dull ache in his chest. He did not argue. In this moment, his mother's rigidity, the very thing he had once despised, now felt strangely familiar, like a wall shielding him from the chaos. "Go rest," Margaret said. "I will take care of Lily." Alexander nodded tiredly. He did not know that this single nod would open the door to another nightmare. Margaret left the study, not returning to her own room as usual. She went upstairs and stopped in front of Lily's bedroom. When the door closed behind her, the atmosphere inside changed completely. Lily sat curled up on the bed, her knees pulled tight to her chest. When she saw her grandmother, she did not run over or call out. She shrank back against the headboard by instinct. "Stop crying," Margaret said. Not loudly, not harshly, but her voice was as sharp as a thin blade. "In this family, we do not cry like the weak." Lily tried to wipe away her tears, her hands trembling. I'm scared," she whispered. "It's very dark in there." Margaret stepped closer, her shadow falling over the child. "That is where disobedient children belong." Her eyes swept over the desk, where a sketchbook still lay. She picked it up and flipped through it with contempt. The childish drawings appeared, 3 figures holding hands beneath a sun. "Nonsense," Margaret said. "You were not born to draw these useless things. Your father is too soft, but from now on it will be different." She set the sketchbook down, her voice turning colder. "Starting tomorrow, there will be no more colored pencils, no more running in the garden. You will learn etiquette. You will learn piano. And if I see even one sheet of paper left lying around—" Margaret paused, forming a thin smile. "You will go back to that old room for longer." Lily nodded repeatedly, pressing her lips together to keep from crying. She did not understand why the grandmother before her, the one everyone called the pillar of the family, made her more afraid than any darkness. Margaret turned off the light and closed the door. The room sank into darkness. Lily lay motionless, her heart pounding, overwhelmed by terror. Clara Hayes stood in her small rented room, her suitcase lying open on the bed. The pale yellow light fell across the clothes she had hastily packed, but she did not truly see them. Clara's mind was still trapped in the Moore mansion, in Lily's bewildered eyes, in the small yet haunting detail of the latch locked from the outside, and in Rose and Helen's evasive looks as they lied. She placed her hand on the suitcase handle and took a deep breath. Leaving now would be the most reasonable choice. Leaving to protect herself, to avoid a battle she had neither the money, the power, nor the status to win. But the moment that thought formed, Lily's image surfaced. The trembling child who held no resentment toward Clara, only fear of something the adults deliberately refused to see. Clara released her grip on the suitcase. "No," she whispered into the empty room. "I can't leave her there." She opened her handbag and searched for something familiar. It was an old light brown teddy bear, its fur worn thin in places, a keepsake from her college days. A few months earlier, Clara had discreetly fitted a tiny camera into the bear, the kind commonly used for remote child monitoring. At first, she had bought it merely to watch her dog when she worked late. Somehow, she had ended up bringing it with her when she moved into the Moore mansion. Clara stared at the bear for a long moment. Her heart pounded. This was a gamble. If she was wrong, she would become an intruder, someone accused of illegal surveillance. But if she was right, if her instincts did not deceive her, then this was the only way to save Lily. She zipped her handbag, stepped out of the rented room, and called a taxi. But the car did not take her out of the city. It took her back to the road leading to the Moore estate, where she had just been thrown out like a criminal. When Clara knocked firmly on the large wooden door, Alexander appeared almost immediately. His face was etched with exhaustion and irritation. Behind him stood Margaret Moore, upright and cold-eyed, assessing. "What are you doing back here?" Alexander asked hoarsely. "I made myself clear." "I'm only asking for 5 minutes," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though her knees were shaking. "Lily has just suffered severe trauma. If she is suddenly abandoned like this, the damage will follow her for life. I'm not asking to stay. I just want to say goodbye to her properly." Margaret let out a soft, thin, cutting smile. "She doesn't need your theatrics." Clara turned to face her directly for the first time, no longer avoiding her gaze. "Then supervise me. Stand there and watch me. Don't leave me alone with Lily for even 1 second." Alexander hesitated. The image of Lily trembling in his arms earlier that afternoon surfaced in his mind. At last he stepped aside. "5 minutes," he said. "My mother will be there." In the bedroom, Lily sprang up when she saw Clara. "Miss Clara!" She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her like clinging to a final lifeline. Clara's heart tightened. "I have to go away for a while," Clara whispered, holding Lily tightly. "But I'm not leaving you." Lily sobbed softly. "I'm scared of Grandma." Margaret gave a dry chuckle from the doorway. Children talk nonsense. Clara did not argue. She gently placed the teddy bear into Lily's hands. "This is the night guardian bear," she said very softly. "It will stay here and watch everything. Put it somewhere high where it can see the whole room." Margaret glanced at the bear, frowned, then turned away disdainfully. "Just trash?" Clara bent down and whispered quickly into Lily's ear. "Hide it. Don't let anyone take it." When Clara left the Moore estate for the second time that night, her hand clenched tightly around her phone. The screen lit up. The connection had been established. The teddy bear had begun to see. Margaret Moore dragged Clara Hayes down the staircase like a condemned criminal. In the grand hall, Alexander Moore stood waiting, his gaze empty and cold. "What did you come here to prove?" he asked, his voice dry and hollow. "I came because there's something that won't let me leave in silence," Clara replied. "That's enough," Margaret cut in, her icy hand forcefully shoving Clara toward the door. "Leave at once, and stop poisoning my son with those melodramatic words." Clara did not resist. She allowed herself to be pushed into the cold, dark hallway. But before the door closed, she turned back to look at Alexander one last time. "Look carefully at the person standing beside you," she said softly but clearly. "Blood does not always mean protection. Sometimes it is only an excuse to legitimize abuse." The heavy wooden door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the silent mansion, like an invisible gunshot tearing through the night. It was late at night. The Moore estate lay under a false stillness, the kind of silence that exists only when something evil is waiting for the right moment to surface. Alexander sat alone in the living room, all the lights turned off, the only glow coming from the pale blue light of his phone lying on the table. The whiskey bottle beside him was already half empty, but the alcohol could not numb the growing sense of unease tightening around his chest. Clara's words as she left kept echoing in his mind, sentence by sentence, refusing to fade. "Lily isn't afraid of me. She's afraid when I'm gone." Alexander told himself it was merely the manipulation of a desperate woman. But the harder he tried to push it away, the more clearly he remembered his daughter's eyes, the panicked look she cast toward the dark staircase leading to the second floor. His phone vibrated. Alexander flinched and glanced at the screen. A message from Clara. "Don't believe me. Don't believe my words. Believe what your own eyes see. Click this link. Now." His finger hovered above the screen. A part of him, the cowardly, selfish part, wanted to delete the message, to stand up, go to bed, and let everything pass. But then another image appeared in his mind. Lily curled up on the cold tile floor, trembling in that dark room. Alexander tapped the link. The screen went dark for a few seconds, then a grainy black and white image appeared. A familiar corner of a room, the small bed, the study desk, moonlight spilling faintly through the window. It was Lily's bedroom. "Clara," Alexander whispered. A sick feeling rose in his stomach. Was she spying on his daughter? He was about to turn off the screen, but then, in the video, the bedroom door slowly opened. Alexander held his breath. A tall, thin figure entered the room. Her steps were slow, silent, nothing like someone who had come to comfort a child. Slanted moonlight revealed a familiar face. Margaret Moore. "She's just checking on the child," Alexander muttered, as if reassuring himself. "She's just her grandmother." But in the very next second, Margaret reached out and yanked the blanket violently off Lily. On the screen, Lily jolted upright in panic. She curled in on herself, raising her arms to shield her head by instinct. Alexander sprang to his feet, his heart pounding. "Get up!" Margaret's voice came through the phone speaker, devoid of warmth or affection, filled only with icy malice. "Do you think, after what you did this afternoon, you still have the right to sleep peacefully?" Alexander staggered back a step, his face drained of all color. "Grandma, I'm sleepy," Lily said, her voice trembling. "Don't call me Grandma." Margaret grabbed Lily's thin arm and dragged her off the bed. Lily fell to the floor, but Margaret did not let go. "You're weak, just like your mother, crying, drawing useless nonsense." Alexander pressed the phone to his ear, his hand starting to shake uncontrollably. Margaret bent down and pulled several colored pencils from her pocket, the ones Clara had bought for Lily. "Found these under the mattress, didn't I?" she said, snapping each pencil slowly, deliberately. Crack, crack. The sound carried clearly through the speaker, like bones breaking. "Don't! Please!" Lily whispered. "Shut up!" Margaret struck hard at the small hand shielding Lily's face. "I told you, there is no room in this house for trash. Clara taught you those stupid things, but she's gone. I made sure of that." Alexander felt nauseated. The room spun around him. "Do you know why she left?" Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower, more vicious. "Because you are a burden. No one wants a broken, useless child like you." "That's not true," Lily cried out, her voice breaking with desperate sobs. "Miss Clara loves me. She said she would come back." Margaret laughed, a dry, chilling laugh. "No one is coming back for you. You only have me, and you will live by my rules." Alexander could barely breathe. In the video, the door opened again. Rose and Helen stepped inside, their faces pale. They stood motionless, heads lowered. "If either of you opens your mouth," Margaret said, without even turning to look at them, "I will say you stole from this house. The police will believe me. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," the two women replied, their voices trembling. Alexander let the phone fall onto the table. The dull thud echoed through the dark room, but the screen remained lit. The truth was still unfolding, raw, brutal, undeniable. Not Clara. It had never been Clara. A primal fury surged through Alexander, sweeping away all fear and hesitation. He grabbed the phone, not as if holding a device, but as if clutching proof of his own blindness and stupidity. In the video, Margaret dragged Lily toward the door. "Now go into the laundry room. Stay there until you learn how to be silent." "No, I don't want to go into the dark place," Lily sobbed. Alexander could not listen any longer. He rushed toward the staircase. Each step beneath his feet seemed to tremble with the fury erupting in his chest. Every calculated thought, every controlled instinct of a cold-blooded CEO had vanished. In this moment, only one instinct remained, protecting his child. He had just reached the end of the second-floor corridor when he saw it. Margaret Moore was dragging Lily out of the bedroom. The little girl was crying without sound, her small feet slipping across the wooden floor, her hands desperately clawing at the doorframe in a reflex of panic. Rose and Helen stood pressed against the wall, hands trembling, heads bowed, too afraid to intervene. "Stop!" Alexander's voice cut through the air, low, sharp, freezing the hallway into absolute silence. Margaret turned. For a split second, she startled. but her face quickly settled back into its familiar composure, the mask she had worn for decades. "Alexander, you startled me," she said, releasing Lily. The child immediately crawled backward toward the wall, curling into herself. "She had a nightmare. She's overly sensitive. I was only trying to calm her down." Alexander did not answer. He silently raised his phone. The screen was still lit. The live stream was still running. On it was Margaret just seconds earlier. Same posture, same voice, displayed with merciless clarity. Truth and lies stood side by side, naked and unforgiving. The smile on Margaret's lips stiffened. "That's enough, Mother," Alexander said quietly. His voice was neither raised nor shaking, but something inside it had completely shattered. "I've seen everything." Margaret looked at the screen. For the briefest moment, a thin crack appeared in her eyes. Then she lifted her chin proudly. "Everything I do is for you," she said quickly. "For the Moore name. That child is weak. If she isn't disciplined, she'll become a burden." "By torturing her?" Alexander roared. For the first time, his voice thundered through the hallway. "By locking her in a dark room? By breaking her toys? By telling her her father doesn't love her?" He stepped forward. "Is that your idea of discipline?" Margaret retreated half a step, just slightly, but Alexander saw it. He turned to Rose and Helen. "And you." Both women collapsed to their knees. Helen sobbed. "We're sorry, sir. She threatened us. She said she'd have us imprisoned." Alexander stared at them for a long moment. The anger in his eyes had faded, leaving only cold finality. "Fear does not excuse watching a child be abused and staying silent," he said. "You are dismissed. You have 1 hour to leave this house. If I see either of you here after that, I will personally call the police." Rose and Helen nodded frantically, almost crawling down the stairs. Alexander turned back to Lily. He knelt, lowering himself to her eye level. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "No one will ever hurt you again." Lily stared at him in confusion, then burst into sobs and threw herself into his arms. Alexander held her tightly, as if letting go would cause the world to collapse all over again. Margaret let out a scornful laugh. "How pathetic! You destroy the order of this house for childish emotions. And what now? Are you going to take her away with that woman?" Alexander stood, still holding Lily. His eyes were now fully clear, cold, sharp, and resolved. "I don't know whether Clara will ever forgive me," he said. "But I do know this. I will never trust you again." He walked toward the staircase. "This house," Alexander said without turning back, "you can keep it. You love it more than you love people. It suits you." Margaret froze. "Alexander, you can't—" But he had already turned away. And with every step leaving that hallway behind, Alexander Moore knew he had ended not just a night of horror, but a toxic cycle that had poisoned generations. Dawn was approaching when Alexander stopped the car in front of an old apartment complex hidden behind a row of silent streets. The pale yellow streetlights spilled across the cracked pavement, reflecting the exhaustion carved deep into his face. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head resting on his jacket, her breathing steady. Yet she still flinched from time to time, as if fear had not yet released its grip. Alexander turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds. This was not the Moore mansion. This was not the world of power where he was used to giving orders and being obeyed. Here he was only a man carrying his daughter, and an apology that might already be too late. He lifted Lily into his arms and climbed the narrow stairs leading to Clara's small apartment. In front of the faded wooden door, his hand trembled as he raised it to knock. Each knock landed heavily, as though striking directly against his own conscience. The door opened. Clara stood there, still wearing last night's clothes, her hair disheveled, her eyes red from crying. In her hand was her phone, the screen still glowing, displaying the empty room where Lily had once been. When she saw the two of them, the phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. "Lily," Clara whispered. She dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Lily fully woke, recognized Clara, burst into tears, slipped from Alexander's arms, and ran into her embrace. Clara held the child tightly, kissing her forehead and messy hair, checking her small hands and shoulders as if afraid that even a second of delay might make Lily disappear again. "You're safe. I'm here," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. Alexander stood frozen. He had never felt so unnecessary in his life. Then he knelt down, not in the posture of a man performing a scene, but of someone completely brought to his knees. "I'm sorry," Alexander said, his voice shattering. "I was wrong. I didn't believe you. I let them hurt you. And her." Clara did not look at him right away. She continued holding Lily, gently stroking her back. When she finally looked up, there was no hatred in her eyes, only a deep, quiet pain and a very real caution. "I warned you," Clara said softly. "I told you to look, but you chose not to believe." "I did look," Alexander replied, tears falling. "And I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. My mother is out of our lives now, that mansion as well. I have nothing left to defend." Lily looked up at the two adults. "Aunt Clara, Daddy saved me," she said quietly. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. A long, trembling breath escaped her. She looked at Alexander again, not with blind love, but with serious consideration. "We can't go back to the way things were," she said. "No more big house, no more pretending to be happy. If you want to be with her, and with me, you have to start over, from the beginning." Alexander nodded without hesitation. "Anywhere is fine, as long as it's safe, as long as she's free." In that moment, there were no grand promises. Only three exhausted souls standing at the edge of night, holding on to one another like a fragile but real lifeline. 6 months later. The new house had no tall iron gates or cold marble floors. It was a small yellow-painted home in a quiet town where mornings began with birdsong and the smell of toasted bread drifting through the kitchen. The space was simple but warm, a feeling the old mansion had never provided. Alexander stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, washing the breakfast dishes. No suit, no phone vibrating nonstop. Just an ordinary father in a small kitchen. He glanced toward the porch and smiled. Lily lay on her stomach on the wooden floor, drawing. Boxes of crayons and watercolor paints were scattered around her in innocent chaos. Her cheeks were smudged with color, her eyes bright as she filled the page with crooked but lively circles. She was drawing our home, a small house with 3 figures holding hands beneath the sun. Clara brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and sat on the front steps. She watched Lily with gentle eyes, no longer shadowed by constant fear. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "Our house," Lily answered, then pointed to a small brown circle in the corner of the picture. "And the night guard bear." On the wooden shelf near the porch, an old brown teddy bear sat neatly in place. The hidden camera had long been removed, but the bear remained, no longer guarding the darkness, but standing as a symbol of truth and safety. Alexander sat beside Clara and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Here, I have peace," he said softly, "and she has freedom." His phone vibrated inside the house. Perhaps a lawyer, perhaps the final news about Margaret Moore and the empty mansion she still occupied alone, along with a title and pride that had lost all meaning. Alexander did not go inside to answer. He let it ring into silence. Lily ran over, holding up her drawing. The 3 of them leaned in together. The picture was imperfect, colors smudged, shapes uneven, but it was bright, alive, and filled with freedom. In the afternoon sunlight, the small family sat side by side, without the need for grand promises. They had passed through the darkness, and what they kept was not fear, but truth, safety, and a love without conditions.